Today we're going to talk about running classic 1980s TSR era adventure modules with ShadowDark. If you're a modern gamer, you have a remarkable opportunity to go back and experience the iconic adventures from the 1970s and 1980s. They're easy to get on Drive-Thru RPG, either as a PDF or print on demand, and they're not hard to convert. However, there is a hidden danger lurking in them that will flatten a first level party, so we'll talk through that specifically. Now, when I started running one of my recent campaigns, I laid out a bunch of options for the players and they voted what they wanted to do. They chose B5, Horror on the Hill. Now, this has been around for 40 years. I've never had a complete playthrough, so I was kind of looking forward to doing it anyway. So that's the one we're going to use as the example, and as I'm talking through the conversion process, we'll refer back to examples from Horror on the Hill today. Now, since we are talking about an actual module, there could be light spoilers. I assume I'm speaking to referees, so if you're a player, you may want to skip this one. Now, while I'm talking about the adventure, I'm going to roll artwork from Jim Holloway. He's the artist who drew this one. You'll find that his adventurers they're grounded. There's usually some kind of humor in a lot of the compositions. I love how the hobgoblins in this one have googly eyes. Now, this adventure itself, it's about a frontier fort. Imagine a trade route, a trade road that goes as far as it can go. At the end of the road, at the edge of civilization, there's a fort. The fort sits on the edge of a river, and across the river is the wilderness. There's a steaming, smoking hill and a dense forest on the other side of the river, and ruins or rumors about an ancient ruin. And that's the setup for the adventure. The players find themselves at this frontier fort, Fort Guido. They get some rumors, they hire a boat because they want to explore the ruins across the river. And then they find themselves somewhat isolated on the other side of this river, exploring a hostile forest, eventually finding the ruins. There is a multi-level dungeon beneath the ruins, and even yes, they don't show up very often in low-level adventures, and this one actually features a... Now, there is a controversy with this particular module. The only way the players can get into some of the lower levels of the dungeon is if they fall through a trapdoor that sends them down a slide, and then they actually get trapped in the lower levels. This was not entirely uncommon in old school dungeons of the 1970s and 1980s. You'd enter the dungeon thinking it was about exploration. Something would happen. Maybe you get teleported to some random part of the dungeon, or you get dropped through a trap or a slide and find yourself on a lower level. And now the whole purpose of gameplay shifts from exploration to survival. Do you have enough food, water, light sources, etc., or are you tough enough to be able to survive in a more dangerous environment? And can you get out before you run out of equipment or supplies? So Horror on the Hill takes advantage of that trope, and it will strand players if they stumble upon this particular trap. The first conversion type topic is really more about mindset and party composition. I'm reminded of a dungeon tuber some months ago who tried playing ShadowDark, and he and a buddy took like an unarmored cleric and a magic user into a legitimate dungeon, got absolutely flattened in the first room, and said, I'm not an OSR player. And he's right. The designers in the 1970s and the 1980s came from a wargaming background. They thought of dungeon exploration as tactical and strategic, and had in mind that parties going into these dungeons would be tough and well built. So I'll bring up a chart that shows how I think of party composition, especially with a game like ShadowDark. The minimum number of characters you probably want going into something like Horror on the Hill at level 1 is at least 5 characters. The book itself actually suggests that the party, if it's first level, have somewhere between 5 and 10 player characters, including representatives from all these different classes. So in a 5-man group, you probably need 2 fighters, a cleric, some kind of a caster like a magic user, and then a specialist. I find in ShadowDark you don't necessarily need a thief. You can get by with a bard or a seer. And in fact, in some cases, the way they manipulate luck tokens actually makes them stronger than a thief. I also don't think you need a 10-man party either. ShadowDark characters are more resilient than original BX, where if a character dropped to 0 hit points, they were just dead. In ShadowDark, we do have this concept of a death timer and a number of rounds that you can still try to stabilize or revive the character before they're dead. So that makes the player characters more resilient. And then the spell casting system itself is quite a bit more powerful than the BX spell casting system. So you put those two things together and the characters are more resilient. But before you start your first game session, you will want to work with your group and make sure that they're thinking in terms of covering their bases, having a balanced party, making sure that they've got a good mix of fighters and casters and specialists. An unarmored cleric and magic user won't cut it in this kind of adventure. The next conversion topic is about monsters. For the most part, most of the monsters that are going to show up in something like Horror on the Hill are already going to have an equivalent in ShadowDark. So this has a goblin. Just use the ShadowDark goblin. Most of the work's done for you. There will be some monsters you'll want to convert on the fly. The technique I use, which is really easy, I'll bring up an armor class conversion chart. You can see like leather armor maps to 11, chainmail to 13, plate mail to 15. And so you can just reverse the basic armor classes and map them over to the ShadowDark equivalent. I find you look at the hit dice of the monster, which in old school is basically the level of the monster. Just give it a +1 to hit based on its hit dice, and you could use the monster stat block out of the book as is at that point. Armor class, bonus to hit, you're good to go. I did mention that this adventure has so that's probably the one creature that I actually created a conversion for. And right now in ShadowDark, we don't have conversions for young or ancient versions of the dragons. So I did feel obligated to convert that. Now, I mentioned that there's a problem lurking in these old school adventures. Let's bring up 2 pieces of game element. The stat block for the old school ogre and the description of old school sleep. You'll notice that ogres are 4+1 hit dice monsters. They do a lot of damage, but they only attack once per round. And on sleep works on a monster up to 4+1 hit dice. It feels very intentional. As in, we're going to put ogres in our adventures for first level parties to run into. If they've preserved their sleep spell, they can put that ogre to sleep. It's the only thing they can do, but it's a get out of jail free card for an ogre combat. And if not, well, they're either going to run away or they're going to lose some characters. Simple as that. Now let's take a look at the ShadowDark ogre. So we'll bring up the stat block for this guy. Yikes. So it's gone from a 4th level monster to a 6th level. It gets 2 attacks a round at +6 to hit. You figure the typical ShadowDark fighters might have an armor class of 15 or 16, and it gets 2 attacks a round. It's going to hit 50% of the time, and it attacks twice. So it's probably hitting a character every single round. In melee combat, it does 2 to 12 damage. That's an average of 7. The ShadowDark ogre is probably putting to 0 a character per round if a first level party tries to stand toe to toe with it. And if you look at ShadowDark sleep, there's no help. It stops at level 2. So That was one of the shockers for me as I started to run ShadowDark with some of these old school adventures, was the idea that sleep is no longer a get out of jail free card, and players really needed to develop other tactics. And I'm not suggesting at all that you should remove ogres from the old school adventures. They show up in Keep on the Borderlands, in the Village of Hamlet. They show up in this. They're everywhere in the old school adventures. What I'm suggesting you do as a referee is you give your players, before play starts, probably at the same time that you're helping to coach them on how to make a balanced party and how to get into an OSR mindset, that you're not entering a world where fights are fair or balanced, or you're expected to stand toe-to-toe with monsters in an OSR game setting. You're going to have to choose when to run, when to use environmental factors, and when to use tactics in order to level the playing field. And so I think if they go into combat or encounters with ogres with that kind of a mindset, they'll do okay. I've run a lot of ogre encounters now at this point. And yeah, invariably parties do okay if they use good tactics. When my group actually encountered one of the ogres in Horror on the Hill, I think they ended up throwing down caltrops and running away. The ogre injured his feet on the caltrop, so he's not moving as fast, and then they're shooting as they're retreating. They're putting doors between them and the ogre. Eventually, as it continued to follow them, and it wasn't failing morale checks, so it was still in the fight, they whittled it down to a point where now the fighter surged forward and they tried to finish it off in melee combat. But they employed a series of delaying tactics as well as hit and run tactics to whittle it down. That's what my players did. Your players can do it too. The next conversion topic is around treasure and experience points. So old school characters got a lot of their experience from treasure. And so these adventure modules, like the old school adventure modules, they give out a lot of treasure. Horror on the Hill, I added it all up. Players can get like 30,000 gold pieces. So two things there. First, for ShadowDark, divide the treasure by 10. So if they find a necklace that's 1,000 gold pieces in old school terms, the one your ShadowDark players find should be worth 100 gold pieces. That'll bring the old school adventure in line with the treasure expectations of ShadowDark. The experience system works fine. One of the things I noticed is that there's a lot of magic items in these old school adventures. So Horror on the Hill, the players will find a lot of durable items, +1 swords, daggers, pieces of armor, etc. In ShadowDark terms, those are worth 3 experience points each, or 3 experience points if they're in a treasure find, I should say, because there could be multiple items and the whole find is still only worth 3 XP. But there's enough of these 3 experience point finds in Horror on the Hill that players will level up the same whether you're using the old school system or this system. So under like basic expert, where players would be collecting the 30,000 gold pieces, a party can reach 3rd level and possibly as high as 4th level by the end of Horror on the Hill. I added up all the experience in Horror on the Hill, converted to ShadowDark, and the players can still get to 3rd level, possibly even 4th level by the end of the adventure. But you can be confident that your players will level up at the same rate under ShadowDark that they would have under the old school adventure, and they'll be 3rd or 4th level by the end of Horror on the Hill. This isn't really a conversion factor. I like to make maps. I'm not particularly good, but I like to try to upgrade them. So when I ran this, I created a map of the Grand Duchy of Karameikos. Guido's Fort is described in the book through text, but no map is provided. So I created a Guido's Fort map. And I really didn't like the wilderness map itself for Horror on the Hill, so I created my own version. Just because I thought it was funny, I made it look like a comic style theme park map. So that's what we tooled around when I ran this. Again, you can run the maps as is. Let me know if this would be interesting. We run through virtual tabletops, so there are some steps to go through to turn a PDF into something that's ready for the virtual tabletop. So going through our setup could be something I do in a future video if there's interest. Anyway, that's it for today. These are not hard to convert. You've got to think about the party composition and make sure your players are actually ready for that old school mindset where fights aren't balanced and they need to use tactics and they need to have a strong, balanced party. The monsters are easy to convert. Remember, just flip the armor class and give it an attack bonus based on its level. And treasure, just divide the gold pieces by 10 and you should be good to go. I did mention how these adventures are full of +1 generic items, and one of the techniques I use to make those items more useful, I talk about over here in this video. Otherwise, I'll see you all next time.